Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last Thursday was Halloween, and pumpkins across Canada were carved with the haunting letters PMO. Hardly a compliment. On Friday, there were jokes making the rounds that only the drug debacle consuming Toronto Mayor Rob Ford, the Prime Minister's friend, could take this federal government's ethics scandal off the front pages of the newspaper. The Conservatives had a convention in Calgary over the weekend, and the dominant news was not any matter of government policy. It was all about the intrigue surrounding a mysterious $90,000 payment and other chicanery to buy the silence and complicity of a disgraced senator. And on it goes. The government's self-inflicted crisis has made it a target for national questioning and even national ridicule. The motion that we have put before the House today is intended to help Canadians get the basic respect that they deserve by providing a forum within which they can have their many serious questions asked and answered authoritatively about what went so terribly wrong with Senator Mike Duffy and how the Prime Minister and his office got so deeply implicated. Interrogations in the daily question period are obviously useful, but they can only go so far. In the limited time available, question period can't do much more than identify the basic headline issues, and the government's responses in 35 seconds are bound to be a bit superficial at best. And that's compounded by an obvious government strategy to deny, 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 as Colin Thatcher once said, stonewalling any reasonable access to information. But denial, deflection, and obfuscation do not diminish the public's thirst for a complete and honest explanation of what transpired in the Conservative ethics scandal, or the public's absolute right to get such an explanation. The Prime Minister, of course, is the central player. He either appointed or hired every one of the people involved in this scandal. They were carrying out his orders to make the Duffy problem go away. The Prime Minister enabled them. He empowered them. They were accountable to him for what they did and how they did it. And he, in turn, is accountable for them to all Canadians. That point was made emphatically by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, then the government House Leader, on August the 27th, 2010, when a parliamentary committee wanted to interrogate a ministerial staff member about his interference in an access to information proceeding. The minister blocked the employee from answering any questions, relying on the principle of ministerial responsibility. And in the Globe and Mail, on behalf of the government, the minister, now the Minister of Foreign Affairs, then the government House Leader, said this, quote, "The fundamental constitutional principle of responsible government, which is integral to the supremacy of Parliament, provides that ministers are the ones accountable to Parliament, not members of their staff." End of quote. So in the government's own words, Mr. Speaker, it is not appropriate, indeed it's a violation of parliamentary democracy, for the Prime Minister to blame his staff for this scandal or to shift responsibility onto employees or others. When the Prime Minister brutally trashed Nigel Wright in this House last week, when he suggested that Wright and Wright alone was responsible for all the deceit and corruption, he was flatly wrong. The buck stops at the PM, not the PMO. It's the Prime Minister who must answer fully and completely to Canadians. To fail to do so shows utter contempt for the people of this country, who have the right to know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Providing for the Prime Minister to have his day under oath in the court of public opinion will give him an unparalleled opportunity to set the record straight, No more unanswered rants from Mike Duffy. No more speculation by the opposition. No more meddling by the media. The Prime Minister would have an unfiltered occasion to speak directly to Canadians, to tell them what they need to know in the most credible way possible under oath. So that's why this motion is here today. And if Canadians were the ones to be asking the questions, what would they want to know? They might start with the Prime Minister's frame of mind. Last week in Calgary, why did he go so far out of his way to set up an us versus them conflict scenario which depicted anyone who wasn't a sycophantish conservative ideologue as an opponent to be vilified? I couldn't care less what those opponents think, he shouted into the microphone. Add them up, Mr. Speaker. Those opponents constitute a very large majority of Canadians. The Prime Minister owes them all an explanation. What did he mean when he told them he couldn't care less? And does he comprehend that all those Canadians for whom he couldn't care less, all of them know full well that there are two, not one, but two distinct sides to this scandal? On one side, there is the bad behavior of certain senators run amok. And it's interesting to note, Mr. Speaker, last May, as this scandal was developing in the public arena, it was Liberals who prevented the quick sweep under the rug scheme that the government was attempting back in May. We forced a debate in the Senate about the audits. We unwound the government's whitewash. We called for all of the files to go to the RCMP, and we demanded consequences for those who had broken the rules. That was back in May, Mr. Speaker. That's the one side of the scandal, and that's where the government would want the public's focus to begin and end. But on the other side, Mr. Speaker, there's the PMO and the Prime Minister's senior entourage, all those people who were so intensely involved in covering up the embarrassment to the government caused by their highest profile senators getting into such deep trouble. It's the cover-up that converted Mike Duffy's scandal into the Prime Minister's scandal. Right. Indeed, the cover-up is likely the larger problem, because it raises the question of what sort of operating mentality was dominating the PMO on this Prime Minister's watch that led Nigel Wright and so many others to think that a $90,000 payment to a sitting parliamentarian would somehow be okay. And in that regard, here's a sampling of just some of the questions that the Prime Minister needs to answer for Canadians. Before he appointed Mike Duffy to the Senate, what kind of a background check was done? Did he read it? Did the Prime Minister know that Mr. Duffy was a resident of Ottawa and not a resident of Prince Edward Island? Was he eligible to be appointed as a senator representing PEI? When did the Prime Minister first become aware that Mike Duffy had accumulating problems with his travel and living costs? How long before Nigel Wright summoned Duffy to a meeting in the PMO on February the 11th? On February 13th, when the Prime Minister says he ordered Duffy to repay his expenses, what instructions did he give to Nigel Wright or to anyone else to ensure that his orders to Mr. Duffy were in fact carried out properly? In the next 3 months, from February until mid-May, is it conceivable that the Prime Minister was never briefed by his staff about the biggest political problem that was then dogging the government, nor did he bother to ask a single question about how his orders on February 13th were being executed? During that period, Mr. Speaker, from February the 13th until May the 15th, $90,000 was paid to Senator Duffy. Another $13,560 was paid to Duffy's lawyers to cover unspecified legal costs. The course of a forensic audit being conducted by Deloitte was seriously impeded. A Senate report about Mr. Duffy was edited, watered down, and whitewashed to go easy on him. He claims he was threatened and subject to extortion. He also says there was an elaborate communications plan to portray him as an honorable man showing leadership by taking out a home mortgage to cover the $90,000 himself, which was patently untrue. And he says he was specifically coached by the PMO to lie to Canadians about that mortgage scam. All of this was going on in the PMO, right under the Prime Minister's nose, for 3 full months from February to May, and the Prime Minister never noticed a thing. No one told him, and he didn't ask. Canadians want to know how that is possible. They also want to know who all was involved in this conspiracy. The Prime Minister says he found out on May 15th that the cash for Duffy came from Nigel Wright, and he repeatedly claimed that no one else knew anything or did anything. It was Wright and Wright alone. He was the sole architect of this deception. But that's clearly not true. Police documents show others were involved. Media reports have disclosed others still. It's a long list. Duffy, Wright, and Senator Gerstein, now by his own admission. Lawyers Perrin and Hamilton, maybe more. Chris Woodcock, the Prime Minister's Director of Issues Management, who got a detailed email from Duffy outlining the anatomy of the cover-up deal, including possible illegal behaviour in and around the PMO. Senior staffers Byrne, Rogers, Novak, and Van Hemmen. Senators LeBreton, Tkachuk, and Stuart Olson. On and on it goes, as the Prime Minister's entire inner sanctum gets implicated. How is it credible that none of these folks breathed a word to the Prime Minister over a period of 3 full months? His Chief of Staff, his lawyer, his Chief Fundraiser, they had a duty to warn their boss that potentially illegal scheming was going on in his office. More to the point, they had a duty to Canada to stop it. And here's another contradiction. Starting on May 15th, when the media disclosed and the Prime Minister had to concede that Nigel Wright had given Duffy the cash to repay his expenses, the Prime Minister described Mr. Wright as an honourable man, trying to protect taxpayers, trying to help out a dear old friend. He said Mr. Wright continued to have his complete confidence. But then 5 days later, he was gone, thrown under the bus with Duffy and all the rest. What did the Prime Minister learn in those 5 days, from the Wednesday to the Sunday, that totally changed his characterization of Mr. Wright? Why has that characterization continued to worsen over the summer and into the fall to the point where the Prime Minister so vilified Mr. Wright last week? In the search for someone to pay the $90,000, what negotiations took place between Nigel Wright and Senator Gerstein and lawyer Arthur Hamilton? Did the Conservative Party say no as a matter of principle, or did they just say no when the cost rose above $30,000 and up to $90,000? What is the party payment of $13,560 in legal fees really for? Can the Prime Minister or the government produce an itemized invoice from Duffy's lawyers to prove that this party cash had nothing to do with the $90,000 in hush money?
Of course not.
And if Duffy's lawyers obtained that $13,000 by false pretenses, by saying it was in relation to something that it was not, will legal action be taken to get the money back? What were the conversations between Wright and Duffy and various other senators about interfering with Deloitte's forensic audit and whitewashing a Senate report? Who gave those orders and who carried them out? And who in the PMO instructed Mike Duffy to lie on national television about getting a mortgage? Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, Where's the paper trail? In answer to access to information requests and order paper questions, the government has said, incredibly, but repeatedly, that there is not a single shred of paper, not an email, not a note, not a message written on a napkin anywhere in the PMO or anywhere in the government that relates to Duffy or the Prime Minister's scandal. But Duffy has paper, PMO leakers have paper, the police have a lot of paper, and they're looking for more. How is it that all that documentation somehow mysteriously vanished? Is it stored somewhere? Has any of it been destroyed inadvertently? This raises a serious question, actually, for the Clerk of the Privy Council and the Deputy Minister of Justice. What have they done, and what do they continue to do to protect the integrity of the Government of Canada through this whole sordid and tragic affair? But the central actor, of course, remains the Prime Minister. He has the ultimate authority and accountability. None of that can be delegated to subordinates, not to Nigel Wright or anyone else, to assume full responsibility. Only the Prime Minister can answer. The Prime Minister needs to look Canadians in the eye and tell them fully what happened. And accordingly, Mr. Speaker, I move today, seconded by the member for for that one, that the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics be instructed to examine the conduct of the Prime Minister's office regarding the repayment of Senator Mike Duffy's expenses, that the Prime Minister be ordered to appear under oath as a witness before the committee for a period of 3 hours before December 10th, 2013, and that the proceedings be televised. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.